Hello, and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. Law enforcement officers working in plainclothes or undercover is nothing new. What is new is that some officers are now hiding their faces behind masks and refusing to show identification, following a surge in arrests by armed, masked federal immigration agents in unmarked cars. Some California Democrats are backing a new bill in Congress that would bar officials from covering their faces while conducting raids, unless the masks were required for their safety or their health. What's led to the rise of masked policing, and is this what law enforcement should look like in a democracy? Here to dig into those questions and more is former FBI agent Mike German, a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. Thanks for joining me, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
In a recent social media post on X, the Department of Homeland Security took issue with proposed legislation in California, which would ban federal law enforcement from wearing masks. DHS claims that ICE agents are facing assaults and doxing. What are your thoughts on why some officers have made the decision to wear masks? Has there been any official guidance that says officers should be masking?
I haven't seen official guidance going out, but I have seen DHS officials justifying the agents' use of masks and basically giving a green light to that activity through their public rhetoric.
And what are your thoughts on why some officers have made that decision for themselves?
I think there are probably as many reasons as there are officers. I think one of the issues is that they have detailed federal agents from other agencies to do this kind of immigration work, and they're probably respected in their communities and want to maintain their reputation in the work that they do. So I think there's probably a little hesitation to be publicly linked to this kind of immigration enforcement actions that divert resources away from true important law enforcement missions. And I think part of it is to create terror in the community. I mean, masked law enforcement agents is a hallmark of police states, and particularly where you see masked agents not being clearly identified as law enforcement, not identifying the agency they work with, that actually creates a greater threat to law enforcement. These DHS officials are trying to justify it as an officer safety measure, but it's actually the opposite, that when the public or the person being arrested don't know and can't clearly identify you as a law enforcement agent, their inclination would be to resist because you look like any other criminal that is trying to harm them. And certainly for the public at large, when they see some altercation taking place, they may want to get involved to try to protect the person being attacked. And the threat to law enforcement goes up when agents aren't properly identified. That's why, as an FBI agent, when we went out on a raid, we wore these jackets with bright yellow letters saying FBI to make it very clear to everyone that we are law enforcement acting in an official capacity. That's part of the protection that agents get.
Are there risks with having officers from other agencies, as you said, being called to do work they may not have been trained to do?
Significant risk, particularly because different agencies have different authorities. And the authorities that an FBI agent might have on a terrorism case will be different than the authorities ICE ERO agents have in enforcing civil law. So putting a bunch of people together without very clear instructions, very clear guidance, and particularly guidance that's public so the public understands what's happening is crucial. And a lot of this is about making sure there's still public confidence in law enforcement, because law enforcement can't operate where the public no longer trusts it to actually enforce the law rather than to engage in some kind of misconduct or abuse.
Is there danger here, especially in communities targeted by ICE, that there's no way of knowing whether the person behind the mask has a badge?
Certainly, there's significant danger. It's dangerous for the person being targeted because, as we have seen, unfortunately, there are people who impersonate agents and try to use the natural deference that members of the public would give to somebody who is enforcing the law to exploit and victimize that person. So because that's actually a real thing now, it's natural for people to be afraid of somebody who's dressed up in militia gear, not properly identified as law enforcement, particularly when masked, and not willing to show the badge, show the authority, either a warrant or some other legal authority to engage in the conduct. And we're also seeing a lot of very aggressive actions. And what many studies going back to the civil unrest during the 1960s and 70s showed that when law enforcement engages in arbitrary or poorly targeted violence, that often creates more violence. In other words, if they attack a crowd indiscriminately, the crowd will become more violent. So it's a dangerous escalation that's occurring in a lot of these raids that aren't really following proper law enforcement protocols.
What's the significance of some officers perhaps seeing the American public as a threat?
That's a huge problem in a democracy. In a democracy, uh, the officials who enforce the law are supposed to remain under democratic control. Their guidelines should be public. Their activities should be closely overseen and cabined by strong guidelines. But unfortunately, what we've seen, particularly since the 9/11 terrorist attacks, is a loosening of those kind of guidelines, certainly in the federal system with the FBI, where I used to work, but all across the country with law enforcement taking on a greater role in federal law enforcement on task forces, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Task Forces, Safe Street Task Forces, the use of state and local law enforcement intelligence centers called fusion centers, in a network of centers across the country. That this kind of activity is often done very secretively, and anything that's secret is threatening to a democracy. And because there's so little accountability, the public loses confidence in the police department and loses confidence that they are actually working to protect public safety rather than to engage in activities for improper purposes.
There's no shortage of photos and videos of recent ICE raids. Social media allows for the proliferation of that and other police activity. Does this normalize masking? Is this something the public needs to see? What are your thoughts here?
Unfortunately, masking does seem to be normalized, but I think it's less about the fact that there are cameras and more about law enforcement leaders okaying this kind of behavior. And I used to be an FBI undercover agent. I know and respect that people working in particular roles need to protect their identity and their likeness, but they can make that choice and not participating. And that again is a leadership and a management position. If there's somebody who you don't know identified in public because of some important and dangerous undercover assignment, don't put that person on one of these task forces going out in public, engaging in activity that's likely to draw public attention.
Mike, you previously worked undercover in white supremacist and militia groups. How might the current trend towards mass policing impact the work of real undercover agents?
It's quite dangerous. And we saw this happening significantly during the 2020 protests, where these militia groups started dressing like soldiers, started dressing like the police officers. Unfortunately, police officers were more and more also dressing like soldiers with the bulletproof vests and the armor plates and fatigues and camouflage rather than normal police uniforms. The reason the militia groups were doing it was to identify with the police officers. They often, claim to support Blue Lives Matter and otherwise were pro law enforcement. Now that was never actually true, and certainly on January 6th, when a lot of the members of these militant groups went to the Capitol and attacked police officers, injuring more than 100 of them, their love for law enforcement was not genuine. So they're trying to act as if they are also bestowed with some sort of official authority to act against their political enemies. And that creates a very dangerous situation. Of course, There have been many cases of law enforcement officials associating with those groups. So, the, not having clearly identified law enforcement creates the danger that the public will not know whether this person is acting in a legal or illegal capacity.
What recourse do communities have to demand both transparency and accountability when federal officers conduct operations while masked and unidentified?
Well, it's very important for our democratic processes to work and make sure that you're not just your federal representatives, but your state and local representatives as well understand that this is something that creates community harm. It creates dangers that otherwise wouldn't exist. The last thing law enforcement should be doing is engaging in actions that create a more lawless society. So it's up to these state and local leaders to make sure their police departments know what the expectation is. And it's up to the state and local police departments to make sure that when the federal government and federal agents are operating in their territory, that they're doing it in an accountable manner.
Are there any reforms you would prioritize right now to restore accountability in federal and local policing?
Certainly, having properly identified agents when they're going out in public in situations where they might be making arrests or engaging in force is critical. Again, there are plenty of studies about crowd control that go back to the 1960s and 70s that demonstrate safer ways to engage the public that is, engaged in protest activity. So these are things that law enforcement knew in the 1990s when I was an FBI agent. Somehow they seem to have forgotten that or are ignoring all that advice. But they have to seek public opinion about what it is they're doing so that they understand why this activity is so harmful to our society.
Mike, thank you so much for being on the excerpt.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.